What is up, people of the Bat family? Welcome to a whopping great big update for the Batman movie. And yeah, when I say there's a lot to break down, what I really mean is there's too much to break down. I mean, I'm not complaining, but this will most certainly be a huge video, because not only do we have various things to cover, from promo, artwork, and new posters dropping, but there's been even more interviews with Dylan Clark, the producer, Matt Reeves, obviously the director, Robert Pattinson, I wonder who he could be, Zoe Kravitz, and others in Movie Maker magazine, which I am going to read out quite a lot of the juicy stuff. I do recommend checking out the magazine for yourself, because I'm going to leave some bits out, but I will be reading out a lot of stuff in this video, so you can bet your ass it's going to be quite a long one. But honestly, the details we're going to get into cover so many things, like how Robert Pattinson was joking about working out. Thank you! All those people can shut up now, and so many more other details from that magazine. We've got the runtime of the movie pretty much solidified now, on top of the actor for Thomas Wayne and a billion other things. I think I'm forgetting, because there's too much. I'm gonna shut up now and actually get into the first stuff I want to talk about. Let's talk about the new posters and artwork that, you know, the Batman page has kind of gone from sleep mode to retweeting all kinds of things. The Warner Brothers accounts were also releasing what you're seeing on screen. So first of all, we've got an amazing poster of a very close-up shot of Batman himself. What I like is a little subtle detail in the eye. If you zoom in there, there's a little Riddler question mark. I mean, there's not obviously too much to say here other than to just like appreciate the marketing for this film. I feel like mostly, if not every poster, has been really spot on and tasteful. We've also got another poster featuring Batman and Catwoman, and I think this is just an amazing shot, and also the detail on it is really nice. Like, you can zoom right up into the detail of their suits there, and obviously Batman and Catwoman are a big duo in this movie. I mean, there's a whole trailer dedicated to them called The Bat and the Cat. It's not like this movie is a co-op movie, so to speak. It's not literally Batman, it's still the Batman, but obviously what they're trying to do is heavily solidify the relationship between Batman and Catwoman, at least in the very origins of their relationship in this movie, so things can blossom out into the couple of more installments we're sure to be getting our way in the next few years. But you know me, guys, I appreciate a good Batcat image, and this poster is badass. Like, they look great. But before we get into the Movie Maker magazine images and then actually get into the interview, I want to first talk about the runtime. Basically, it is very much so solidified that this movie will indeed be 2 hours and 55 minutes, around 175, 176 minutes to be exact. And I don't have any complaints. If you want my full thoughts on the length of 3 hours, I covered my opinion on that in the other video. But long story short, I'm really not complaining. I think this is sweet. I'm glad that they're not sacrificing the fleshing out of the pacing of the story for a shorter runtime to squeeze in even more showings. This is good news. But by the way, as I was recording this video, you can actually listen to 6 minutes or maybe even 7 minutes of Michael Giacchino's The Batman theme. So I reacted to the Batman theme teaser in the Oreo marketing thing of my video the other day. If you haven't seen it, check it out, because I explore the 3D modeled Batcave. We can actually go throughout the Batcave. It was really fun to do that. But in that video, there was a little Easter egg for an extended Batman theme that none of us had really heard that fleshed out before. But today, Matt Reeves tweeted out that you can listen to the whole theme at a certain time, and basically by the time I'm recording this video, there is a YouTube link to listen to it now. I would put it here, but I'm pretty confident I would get claimed on that one. So I'll leave that link in the top pinned comment so you can click on it, listen to the full theme yourself if you haven't heard it already, just to really get you in that Batman vibe. And hey, maybe even listen to it as you're watching this video, especially when we're getting into reading out all of those details later, because it will be kind of like a chilling with Boba whilst hearing all of these magazine quotes and then my opinion kind of session. It's going to go on for quite a while. Now, in other news, we know that Thomas Wayne from the Japanese International trailer was identified. I mean, I was very confident about what you're seeing on screen right now is a Thomas and Martha Wayne with a younger Bruce Wayne, and in the choir, if you will, we see a younger Edward Nashton, aka a younger Riddler, and that all, you know, contributes to the pieces of the puzzle and the mystery that the Riddler is hanging over the Batman with the whole "you're a part of this too." Now, what we have identified clarified since then is that the Thomas Wayne actor has indeed basically revealed himself who he is. The Instagram post goes as follows from Luke J. Roberts. This time last year, I was doing a little last-minute character research in my trailer. Wish I could name drop the movie, but I signed one of those NDA thingies. He face, basically. And it's just like, my guy, you're kind of holding the comic book out there, Sins of the Father, and I wonder who you could be oh, wait, you look just like the guy in the trailer. Oh, yep, you're Thomas Wayne. So he basically did a little bit of an oopsie. I mean, it's not a huge deal. I mean, it's you. We see you in the trailer. But yeah, Sins of the Father, eh? It reminds me of one of the clues that Riddler left to Batman that he actually graffitied on the floor to help his little visual mind map of investigation, the sins of my father, if I remember correctly. So again, just all contributing to how Thomas Wayne, or Wayne for Murderer, as labeled by the Riddler on some of the evidence clippings that we see in the trailers, did something fairly corrupty-esque bad, and Alfred has also been keeping that secret, which also pertains to the line in the trailer where Pattinson's Bruce says, all these years, Alfred, you lied to me. You can see how this is all melding together, but yeah, just thought I'd chuck it out there that Luke J. Roberts is playing Thomas Wayne. To add one more thing on top of that, I don't think that means we're necessarily going to see them get shot again or anything like that. I think it's more that if we do get more than just the evidence board clippings of the photographs of Thomas and Martha Wayne opening up that new orphanage, which I believe was Wayne Manor being converted into a new orphanage, and that's where those photos were taken. They were doing a bit of publicity for Thomas Wayne running for mayor. If it's just beyond those photos, we could actually get scenes of flashbacks with a younger Bruce, his parents there. Rather than seeing them die, it would just maybe flesh out the context as to why the younger mini Edward Nashton has written on that evidence board clipping saying, if only I knew then what I know now, and just giving more context to the Wayne for murderer rather than mayor comments. Like, there's obviously this big revelation to do with Bruce's parents and how they aren't really, or should necessarily not be, on the pedestal he's put them up on his whole life. And that's when he's going to confront Alfred. There'll be a little bit of a row there, I'm sure, but yeah, it's all connected. In other news as well, just before I chuck this in here, we are getting some little promo videos from Hot Toys and their Batman figures. I just thought it would be cool to overlay that clip on the screen. It seems that they've got something cool cooking up there. I would personally love to get some of these myself. They're saying, get a first look at the Dark Knight and his crime-fighting arsenal. The Batman movie-inspired collectible series is to be revealed very soon, and we're just getting some really cool, you know, as I said, little, I don't know if you want to call them a teaser trailer or whatever, but for their new collectible series. And is anybody else's wallet just... Fuck. Alright, so for some of the images that I just wanted to dive into quickly before getting into the meat of the magazine coverage and interviews, is that some of these are taken from that magazine, Movie Maker magazine, that they attached to the article pages, but I've just, you know, extracted them so we could look at them in a little bit more detail. And also, one of the images is exclusive to Pursue News, which I wanted to start with first before we move on to the Movie Maker magazine photos. And the first one from Pursue News is this image of Robert Pattinson's Bruce and Andy Serkis's Alfred. Now, nothing too massively special about this, other than I always just get a bit giddy when seeing a new image, of course, and it's just nice seeing Bruce and Alfred interact. We have no idea if this is one of those chilling conversations that we've heard Andy Serkis describe before, because at this point they've grown a bit distant, and as I've theorized before, long term, I think they're going to get closer than ever. It's just at the part of where the movie picks up. If anything, if they bump into each other down a corridor, it's a very icy exchange, as I'm somewhat abbreviating from what's been described before. Alfred is concerned about him because Bruce is clearly got such a blurred line between Batman and Bruce. He's diving his whole everything, every waking minute, into being Batman. And without going into a tangent about me fanboying about that relationship, it's just cool seeing another image of that relationship. It is possible that Andy Serkis' Alfred here, what he's got holding there in between his arms could just be like a cane, and that would be a bit of a homage to maybe possibly Batman Earth 1. Fans have been speculating for a while now that Andy Serkis' Alfred could have an injury like some Alfreds do, and that could be why he has a cane, but at the same time, I don't believe we've seen enough of a wide shot of him in any of the other trailers to actually see an actual cane or him using something like that, whether his leg is busted, whether he's even lost a leg or something like that. But some people are thinking as well, that scene where Robert Pattinson's Bruce is kind of looking up at the sky or whatever, he could actually be in a hospital where Alfred has gotten hurt due to whatever the Riddler's done. So maybe Alfred actually gets injured at some point in the movie, if not has already sustained an injury at some point during his military service, and that's why he requires potentially a cane. Now, the Movie Maker magazine has come out with some incredible images. I mean, I absolutely adore this one of Robert Pattinson in the Batman costume. It's just another angle, specifically in that room that we first saw the newspaper clippings from the international Japanese trailer. As you can see on the right-hand side, we see the Thomas Wayne images that I was talking about earlier with his eyes scratched out. So this is in that same room where it says, you know, if only I knew then what I knew now. The kids of the choir with Edward Nashton being young there looking over at the Waynes, that's in this room. And it's just another angle of Batman, and it just makes me appreciate this suit so much. I know everyone is subjective, we all have different tastes. You might absolutely adore the Dark Knight Returns-esque Batfleck Batsuit over this. Fair enough if you do. I think that's a really cool suit as well, but this one is very quintessential Batman to me, especially given the context of where he's at in year 2. I really love it, and this specific angle and shot just makes me love it that much more. I honestly didn't think I was capable of loving it too much more, but then we just keep getting more awesome shots. It's so good. The next image, I believe this was actually shown in the Empire magazine, which we've covered before, but I believe it's still within either Arkham or a GCPD precinct. But I believe it's still related to the image we're talking about after this. But as you can clearly see, there are officers in the background, and we can see that the wonderful Matt Reeves is directing in this specific photo here. But what I also love is that we get another look at that moment in where there's a stretcher in the middle of the room. Do you remember the original DC Fandom trailer? Perhaps you're seeing a scene on screen right now. This is that moment where all of the cops seem to be like grabbing after Batman, or Batman is trying to like rush his way through them because they're in his way. But we have Jeffrey Wright's Gordon here, and this, I tweeted it out saying this is wonderful, a wonderful meme template, because he's just like in between the cops and Batman. He's got like a firm grip on his bulletproof armor there. Batman is looking really brooding and like angry, like as a part of that scene we saw in the trailer. So I really wonder what actually is going on here. Is this after maybe Bruce loses his temper and smacks on the window in the main trailer where he says, "What have you done?" Could it be that something happens after that where the cops aren't happy? Could this be moments before Batman himself needs to escape and grapple up, as we see the cops firing at him in all the other trailers? At some point, something has to cause that damaged and fractured relationship, considering that we see Batman around cops in several other scenes, even when the Riddler is getting arrested in that diner. It's really hard to know, but either way, this is actually, it's not necessarily something I want to call my most anticipated or one of my most anticipated scenes in the movie, but ever since that first DC Fandom trailer dropped, I've always been so fascinated in the scene where Batman is just lunging towards something or trying to get somewhere, and Gordon pins him up against the wall. Here, though, it just seems like he's separating him, but as I said, in that first trailer, we see that Batman kind of lets Gordon push him up against the railings or whatever. So there's clearly some tension between maybe what Batman wants to do here and what the GCPD officers think should be done. Or maybe they're blaming him for something and Gordon is the only cop of reason between the other cops going after Batman. It's so hard to imagine really what's going on, but all I know is I'm deadly excited for it. Now, it's basically time to get into movie making now. Here's the cover for it. An absolutely wonderful image of Matt Reeves directing Robert Pattinson in the Batman suit. It seems to be in the cathedral, so I think this is when all the citizens have run out of the mayor's funeral because Gil Colson has already stormed through. That's why it probably looks a little bit empty in the background, and maybe he's even directing him when the Riddler is reading out those riddles to Batman. I think in one of the recent trailers, he's like, "Justice. The answer's justice," you know? So I think it's around about that time. But now, guys, I'm going to basically do a big readout. And as I said, I really do encourage you to read the interview yourself, because there's some things I'm going to skip over that gets into some of Matt Reeves' younger years and what inspired him to become a filmmaker. So there's lots of little tidbits like that. I'll be leaving a link to Movie Maker magazine in the top pinned comment. You can't miss it. If you go into the comment section, you're going to see my comment there with all kinds of links, and that one will be right at the top. So do check it out for yourself. But now I'm going to get into the quotes, the reading of it. I will probably give my little thoughts when I feel like they're warranted based on whatever I'm reading out. I believe it begins with Matt Reeves' vision and his ideas for the script and the actors praising him about that. But then it gets into a little bit more interesting things with, you know, the characters and their thoughts and how Robert Pattinson feels about this or that. So yeah, you guys are in for a treat if you haven't heard any of this yet. And some of it is just incredible. So big shout out to Movie Maker magazine. This was an incredible scoop. Just, you know, for all the wonderful things that they get into about the Batman, and absolute feat it is, by the sounds of it, of how this movie was made. So it starts off with what everyone involved in the Batman mentions about director Matt Reeves is his specificity. That word always usually makes me trip up. There were times when I thought, maybe we don't need that comma there, says Jeffrey Wright, who plays the incorruptible Gotham cop Lieutenant James Gordon. And he's like, wait a minute, that comma relates to a comma in the next scene. If you take that one out, then it changes the value of the next one. It's a really tightly woven script. Now, that is true to what even I've heard. Like, Matt Reeves is very, very specific, and they get into some of the takes as well, and how Rob was somewhat worried about that, because sometimes they would film things again and again, and again and again and again, and again and again, and it was really draining. Not out of annoyance for, like, Matt Reeves, but, like, the film was very hard, and in a lot of other movies in the industry, I'm not saying other directors don't take a stab again and again with refilming scenes, but Matt Reeves he's a bit of a perfectionist. He seeks it again and again and again and again and again and again. Obviously, that can be quite draining, but delivers such a very, very specific product that Matt Reeves has in his vision. And again, that's something I've heard through in between the grapevine, and it matches up perfectly to what Movie Maker magazine have got out of the cast and the director from this interview. So speaking to Wright, a few months before the film's release, I assumed he was kidding about the comma, trying to make a point about Matt Reeves' exactitude without giving away any plot points of the most anticipated movie of 2022. So I asked Reeves. I'm sure that is true, he says, adding, hearing that makes me feel somewhat bad. The first thing I'm doing when I'm working is I'm trying to internalize everything, because if I have it internalized, then my compass is functional, Reeves explains. So I'm trying to feel what it would be like for everybody, but I'm not the actor that any of these people are. I'm just an actor on paper in my head and in a vision, and I have an instinct about what the emotional path is. So when Jeffrey comes in, he has so many great ideas. He's an amazing actor, so he brings something to life. So the last thing I'd want to do is to have him do it the way I would do it, because it won't nearly be as good. But the specificity of the comma has to do with emphasis, and that is narrative. There are moments when the comma is narrative. The comma is something that sets something apart that's going to come back in an important way. And this story in particular is the most intricate narrative I have ever tried to tackle. Now again, just my words on that is that what makes me so excited about this movie, just beyond visual or like whatever they're aiming for with the plot, is just how much Matt Reeves has poured his soul into this movie. It's just ever so apparent even outside of this interview. Carrying along as Robert Pattinson gets into this, so the details really do matter, says Robert Pattinson, who plays Bruce Wayne in Batman, two personalities who are painfully intertwined in the Batman. Pattinson says he was worried at first when Reeves would ask for a lot of takes. Your first thought is, oh my god, I'm absolutely terrible. But when Reeves would show him the playback scenes, which Reeves likes to do, he began to see the same make or break nuances the director did. For example, the mask. The Batman cinematographer Greg Fraser, who also shot Rogue One, a Star Wars story, told Pattinson early on, the two most difficult things to light are Darth Vader's helmet and the cow. There's a whole different language, body language, you have to learn to make it do what you want it to do, says Pattinson. If you look too much into the light, it looks completely ridiculous and you're wearing a Halloween costume. But if you're like 2 millimeters down, it's like, oh, that's completely totemic. And like it looks exactly how it's supposed to look. But to learn how to feel that and learn how to react to how the light hits it takes forever. So again, you know, it says every millimeter matters after that. It's like a very grueling almost process making this Batman movie, but it will deliver the most beautifully shot and every other word under the sun in every other category movie or Batman movie hopefully we've had yet. I know that is kind of presumptuous to say, but from what I've seen and what is always being described, this is going to be something to appreciate on so many different levels. And just the sheer amount of effort that requires to kind of go really above and beyond and then above and beyond to achieve what exactly Matt Reeves is going for. Because as it says here, every millimeter matters. There was a scene where I, Selina, was coming out of a club and I'm upset, recalls Zoe Kravitz, who plays Selina Kyle, as we know. And he said, you know, you walk out and you're upset and your mouth is kind of open because you're breathing and because you're emotional. And then you're closing your mouth, but we're just kind of getting rid of the emotion just slightly. So try to keep just your mouth relaxed the same way. But then I watched back and I can see the difference and I was like, you're a freak, and I love it. Again, that specificity that Matt Reeves has can be quite taxing at times, but deliver a product that is unmatched. It goes on to say that besides directing the Batman, Reeves co-wrote the script with Peter Craig. Every day, night and day, he eats, drinks, sleeps, Batman, and all the characters in this mythology, says Colin Farrell, who plays Oz, aka the Penguin. He's no doubt hunched over a monitor as we speak, still finishing putting the final touches together. Matt is the most specific person and director I've ever worked with, adds Kravitz, and I really think it's one of his biggest strengths. I think sometimes he beats himself up about it because he can probably drive himself almost crazy sometimes, but his specificity is really beautiful, especially in a film like this where it can be so easy to just focus on the big action sequences or the explosions, and he will pay attention to the way you put down a cup. Now, around about this point in the magazine, it gets into Matt Reeves as a kid, his inspiration into film, as I mentioned, but what we're going to get into now is when they say syndicated Batman episodes provided a joyous, colorful backdrop to many 1970s childhoods, but also lurking in the background were frequent references to something called Watergate, a real-life, cynical political drama that in 1974 brought down the President of the United States. Two key characters in the Batman, Gotham Mayor Don Mitchell Jr. and District Attorney Gil Colson, share last names with key figures in the Watergate scandal. Now, ask Matt Reeves if there's any significance to his use of the names Colson and Mitchell, and you'll see how methodically he's thought everything through. I wanted to do a story in which the corruption of Gotham was one of the most important aspects of the story, because Gotham is a sick place. Bruce is desperate to try and make a change, says Reeves. He's still stuck, to be honest, emotionally stunted at being 10 years old, because that's a trauma you don't get past, witnessing your parents' murder in this place. He's looking to create meaning, right? This is the only meaning he can find. I think he imagines that if he can do this, somehow he can reverse what's happened, which will never be reversed. This is a very human impulse, right? To try and relive something and remake it. And again, guys, when he gets on to talk and spit out things like that, it gives me chills almost. I love entering that mind, and like, you can only imagine the things that he's told Robert Pattinson to help get in character there. But the way he kind of encapsulated that, and the way Bruce feels as if what he's doing to Gotham is almost his way of trying to reverse his parents' death. And yes, face value is like, well, duh, but it's so much more intricate than that, with the way he, speaks these words out there, in how he's kind of stuck, to be honest, and he's looking to create meaning, and that only meaning he can find is that if he imagines he can do this, maybe it can somehow reverse what's happened. But Bruce just hasn't processed anything enough to do with his parents like that to really think how it kind of won't, but you know, maybe he can do something regardless. Again, just me fanboying out about Matt Reeves and how he is the perfect guy to tackle this. He understands it like no one else. Now, Reeves notes that from the first appearance of Batman, Detective Comics 27, published in May 1939, creators Bob Kane and Bill Finger presented him as a noir figure, in line with the other hard-charging detectives of the novels, comics, and films of World War II and the post-war era. Now, the comics would eventually come to describe him as the world's greatest detective. This idea of a place that is corrupt and you try to swim against the tide in order to fight against it and make a difference is quintessential Batman. And at the center of those noir stories is almost always the detective, right? And that's why he is the world's greatest detective. And so this story is, in addition to being almost a horror movie and a thriller and an action movie, at its core, it's also very much a detective story. It's very narrative. And that's something we've heard, and I'm sure will make some of you happy hearing Matt Reeves say these words again. It's almost multi-genred in the sense that horror, thriller, action, but at its core, very noir detective. And guys, I can't contain it. I just love hearing all of this. Now this is where it says, Wright concurs. Matt built an architecture within his script that was extremely well considered, and Pattinson was impressed that all the detective talk wasn't just lip service. In the first meeting, he was saying, we want to lean into the world's greatest detective aspect and be a detective noir movie, he says. And, you know, normally when directors say that, they just do like a mood board and it's just, you know, about the imagery. But I read the script and it's a detective movie. It happens all the time in the graphic novels, but it's always kind of on the back burner in the movies. They talk about the film noir of the 1930s and 40s and how that was a major point of reference for Roman Polanski's 1974 neo-noir Chinatown. And this is where Reeves says Chinatown is a kind of metaphor for just how corrupt we are. And so I knew that this story was going to be, as he went on this path, to come to understand these crimes that he's being led on by the Riddler. It needed to go back ultimately into a sense of expansive history that started to explain why this place was this way in a way that, while it starts seemingly on this path that's impersonal because he's investigating these crimes, it ends up taking him in unexpected ways to something that was incredibly personal, and as we all know, that's leaning into his own family's connection into why Gotham is so corrupt and how he's a part of this too. The magazine goes on to say that he didn't want to do another origin story. We've all seen Bruce Wayne's parents die outside a theater, inspiring his crusade against crime. There had to be a very deep conspiracy going on, and so I watched All the President's Men. I reread the book, and I just started saying, okay, so how do we start to describe just how high the corruption went? It's very much like All the President's Men in that way. Enter another dark icon of the 1970s, the never-identified Zodiac killer who taunted the Bay Area detectives who tried in vain to stop him. The Zodiac inspired the Riddler, played in The Batman by Paul Dano. The premise of the movie is that the Riddler is kind of molded in an almost Zodiac killer sort of mode, and is killing very prominent figures in Gotham, and they are the pillars of society. These are supposedly legitimate figures. It begins with the mayor, and then it escalates from there. And in the wake of the murders, he reveals the ways in which these people were not everything they said they were. And you start to realize there's some kind of association. And so just like Woodwork and Bernstein, you've got Gordon and Batman trying to follow the clues to try and make sense of this thing in a classic kind of detective story way. Now, I don't want anyone getting too carried away with these people getting killed and their true illegitimate ways coming to the surface, and how you start to realize there's some kind of association. That doesn't immediately mean Court of Owls, because they might be associated, you know? Just wanted to put that out there. Reeves goes on to say that I wanted bits of those names because I wanted the conspiracy to come with that forcefulness of history and believability for me, hence Coulson and Mitchell. Now, All the President's Men was the third film in Pakula's Paranoia trilogy, which began with 1971's Klute. In the film, Jane Fonda plays a matter-of-fact cool girl stalked by a killer. Donald Sutherland plays a private detective who tries to save her. He is smart and determined, but also naive. Reeves and Kravitz talked about Clute a lot. That film kind of became a bible for me in terms of the tone and the relationship between the two of them, and that's one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen. Jane Fonda just blows me away, says Kravitz. Also, one of my favorite actors is Donald Sutherland, says Reeves. And what I love about Donald Sutherland in that movie is he judges her. He judges her, and yet he falls in love with her. And I just thought that there was something about that related to what I thought could be a Batman Selina Kyle story. He doesn't understand what it takes to survive in this place, what you have to do just to survive in a place this rough. Like Bruce Wayne, Selina Kyle has no superpowers. Both rely on their tenacity, deductive skills, and courage, but Bruce is super rich, and Selina has nothing. Selina has had a very difficult life and has lived on the street and is trying to survive, says Kravitz. She really knows how scary the world is. Just based off of certain things that Batman says, she can tell he grew up wealthy. It's a really interesting dynamic, and yet they are very similar. And that really is about them having similar values and about being people who do want to take what they believe into their own hands. They've both also felt like outsiders their entire lives, but I think she has a much harsher view of the world, maybe a nihilistic view. Reeves says Selina helps Bruce realize how much he's taken for granted. And also before we move on to the next bit, I completely agree. They're both extremely similar in that way, and especially in the vision for this film. But when you take into account the contrast of, despite Bruce living with tragedy, growing up very wealthy, and then Selina literally being on the street, it does form, just like how we've talked about in the discussion series videos, like Riddler and how he was formed and how he's doing his own vigilante work, albeit in a much different way to Batman. There's very interesting parallels and contrasts to all of these characters and how it still makes them different characters at the end of the day, albeit still similar in more ways than I think some people even take into account sometimes. But carrying along the route of where Reeves says Selina helps Bruce realize how much he's taken for granted, it goes on to say that it takes a very special safety net to even be able to do what he's doing. Yes, okay, he's risking his life, but he's risking his life in the way that only someone who has all the resources that he has can do. He absolutely has privilege. There's no question he was born with privilege. He is a descendant of city royalty. I wanted him to have an awakening of sorts where he would question her about what she was doing, he says. And she says, you know, I don't know who you are, but whoever you are, you obviously grew up rich. And that's brilliant. This is when we get into a bit of Colin Farrell territory, where it says Colin Farrell, like Reeves, first knew Batman from the campy TV series. One of the more outlandish characters in the Caped Crusaders rotating rogues gallery of villains was the Penguin. And Reeves saw Oz a little bit differently to maybe some of the other over-the-top kind of versions of the character, and goes on to say that Colin Farrell's Oz, who prefers not to be called the Penguin, is the shady proprietor of the Iceberg Lounge, a Gotham underworld hangout doing the bidding of reclusive crime lord Carmine Falcone, of which we haven't even seen a single piece of footage for in any of the trailers. Again, just making me think, will this Carmine Falcone die in this movie? Even though I think that will annoy some fans, because yet again, another Carmine who's introduced in the first movie who maybe dies, but again, would most certainly leave a massive power vacuum for Oz to fill that void instead of doing the bidding of reclusive crime lord Carmine Falcone. I guess Penguin is, at least for now, his front man. There's a certain amount of brokenness in Oz that I think, as a reference, not from my performance-wise, but just emotionally as a reference from Matt, I think Fredo from The Godfather was a bit of a reference, says Farrell. Farrell's performance is by no means an imitation of Cazale's. He's doing something entirely new and is unrecognizable thanks to the work of the makeup artist Mike Marino, but he shares Fredo's sense of being stepped over. Matt was just talking about somebody who had very real and very lofty ambitions, but never really had the opportunity or the chance to explore them, and was maybe looked upon as someone who was handicapped, whether it was psychologically, intellectually. Fredo was frowned upon as less than the other brothers. And maybe Oz as well in his life was looked upon as somebody who wasn't capable, says Farrell. And so that's one of the things that fuels Oz, and that is very, 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 very accurate to the character. And again, I've mentioned this before because I think they're regurgitating some similar comments here from previous interviews, but it reminds me of what Robin Lord Taylor's backstory was in Fox's Gotham, since whether you loved this or hated this, the fact that that dived into a before Batman mode, we got to see a bit of the way they explored before Penguin, or the Penguin, right? And he was fueled by a very similar underestimation of who he is, and that's where Oz tends to rise, and probably most certainly will in this live action The Batman universe as well. Now, when it comes to getting into the suit, the design, it goes on to say that no matter how well made they are, one thing that tends to separate Batman movies from the kinds of films that Oscar voters like is the idea of a vigilante disguising himself as a scary animal. A childish image many cineasts just can't get past. Even in the early comics, there was something which I really liked, says Pattinson. In a lot of the early tellings of it, he's just sitting at home, and a bat just smashes through the window, and he's like, "That's it, I'll be a bat." He laughs. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And yeah, I totally get what Pattinson's saying now. Do not be offended of like, oh, that doesn't make sense whatsoever. He just means like, when you look at it at face value, a bat flies through the window, he's like, oh, that's it, I'm gonna be a bat. But it goes on to say that the Batman script, Pattinson explains, finally embraces the madness. There's an element in the other iterations of the story where Bruce goes off, does his training, masters himself, and then comes back to Gotham as a fully realized character, and the delineation between Bruce and Batman, the public Bruce, the private Bruce, and the Batman Bruce are all very contained, and he can control them more easily, says Pattinson. And in this, the lines have totally blurred. His self as Bruce is sort of disintegrating. And now I find it very interesting. I do not want to read into what he said too far there, in terms of when he says there's an element in the other iterations of the story where Bruce goes off, does his training, masters himself. Now, that does make me think just for a split second, because I've been speculating about this quite a lot. What is Reeves going to do with his training here? Does he still go around the world before where we pick up in the movie? Because don't forget, we're 1 year, 6 months in year 2, and we can't forget that this isn't an origin tale. So what I'm trying to say is, what clues are we going to get to his training? And I just wanted to bring up the fact that he says in these other iterations of the story where he goes off, does his training, but then I think he was getting more into the fact that, you know, he comes back and there's quite a separation between Bruce, you know, the Playboy persona, the Batman persona. I think that's more what he was getting at, but it just made me think, like, just like some fans are thinking maybe, it's like Batman Earth 1, which is quite different. Did Alfred just train him? Now, I don't necessarily think that will be the case, by the way, and before getting into a whole tangent about this, because he does seem quite competent with his fighting in the trailers, so I do still think that Bruce, whether he didn't go over to like 20 different trainers, it may have just been a few. It still is yet to be seen if he has been trained by different senseis and gurus around the world in a super traditionalist canonical way that Batman tends to, you know, be like. And yeah, it just makes me wonder, and I would love to know your thoughts on that. But I'm guessing we will get some clues to that in the movie, albeit though it isn't an origin. So how would that get brought up anyway? Maybe through Alfred just kind of saying, I thought when you trained around the world, Bruce, that, you know, this would mean this. Maybe a line, a simple throwaway line like that. But either way, the magazine then goes on to talk about his massive breakout success in the Twilight movies, and after that, Pattinson took up to prove himself outside the big franchises, even though when he got cast, the amount of people on my timeline were just like, oh, that's Twilight boy, but I was just like, just saying what this magazine's saying. He took care to prove himself outside of those big franchises. You know, skipping to Dylan Clark, the producer's comments on that and how they took note, we're like, he's making insanely bold choices, this guy. He went from being, very early on, in a giant franchise where he was a poster boy to really pushing himself as an actor, working with incredibly talented directors and pushing himself all the way, and we just respected that. Then they go on to talk about when Ben Affleck, who played Bruce Wayne in Batman vs Superman, etc., decided not to go ahead with plans to star and direct in his own solo Bat film, Warner Brothers turned to Matt Reeves, who enlisted Clark to join him on the project. Meanwhile, as questions swirled about who would replace Affleck under the cowl, Pattinson became fascinated by the idea of taking on the role. What Pattinson didn't know was that Reeves had begun writing the Batman with him in mind, which is crazy. That's crazy. Batman is an amazing myth that has endured for over 80 years, says Reeves. And it's because of that crazy mix, there's a part of it that is just simply cool, right? He looks cool, he's got a cool car, he's got all the stuff, he's like James Bond, I guess, in a certain way, right? But there's also something very relatable to the pain that he's gone through. And so that, for me, was how you ground it. Those aspects are part of the story, and this story emphasizes those things. This story pulls those things out. So that's why I was so excited about Robert Pattinson, because he's such a wonderful actor, and I knew that he would be able to go on that search with me for the depth and complexity of this character. I mean, I knew he wasn't going to play him straight ahead. In writing from the beginning, I was imagining the character in my head, and I started watching movies of actors in the age range, and he just really kind of captivated me. And I started writing for him at a certain point. I had no idea if he would ever want to be in the movie. Reeves had spent many years resisting blockbusters for fear of too many cooks and too many concessions to corporate demands, and he was worried that Pattinson might have a similar aversion to big budget films, just like a lot of actors and directors tend to do. Sometimes it can get a bit too corporate there. And Pattinson says, I've never auditioned for any comic book movies before. And at the time, even my agents thought it was pretty out of character to just suddenly get fixated on Batman. And I didn't even really know the status of the project. Around that time, Pattinson and Clarke had a general meeting about potential collaborations with no specific project in mind. We're talking about 20 different things. And then he starts kind of saying, so what's going on with Batman? Clarke says. As Pattinson, I had no idea that Matt had seen Good Time and thought, I want to do a really dirty, slimy Batman. It was a kind of almost fated thing, says Reeves. Of course, at that point, we were still working on the script, and so there was nothing to share, but I met with him probably about 8 months later, and I shared the script, and we just really connected. Now, to jump forward to some of the other things that I just found really interesting, they get into a bit of the 2020 situation, the pandemic and all of that stuff. It goes on to say that interest in the Batman was so high that Pattinson set off a fandom kerfuffle when he self-effacingly told GQ in an interview conducted from quarantine that he wasn't actually working out that much for the role. I think if you're working out all the time, you're part of the problem, he told the magazine. Yet at the time, I remember making videos. It's just a joke. I guess, well, not many people understand British humor so much. I'm not saying you right there, but like clearly there was a strong response to this. And this magazine says he was being dryingly funny, not that anyone noticed. That really came back to haunt me. I just always think it's really embarrassing to talk about how you're working out, he says, laughing about it now. I think it's like an English thing, exactly. Unless you are in the most unbelievable shape where people are just genuinely curious, going, how have you achieved like physical perfection or whatever? He further clarifies, you're playing Batman, you have to work out, he laughs again. I think I was doing the interview when I was in lockdown as well in England. I was in a lower gear of working out. And then it goes on to say that it's not the first time an offhand comment from Pattinson has been taken too seriously. And this is another thing that I hear from fans, oh yeah, he doesn't wash his hair or something. It's the same thing as saying in an interview when I was like 21 that I didn't wash my hair, he laughs. It just sticks for 15 years. And again, it is, yeah, kind of that situation. I remember people were going absolutely crazy about him maybe not working out. Strong responses. And yeah, sure, I could say that. I didn't know for a fact that he was joking or whatever, but it just felt so obvious to me. It felt so obvious. So that is the main bulk of what I want to talk about. They do get into like how it was like a military operation, recalls Pattinson, when it came to like earpieces and, you know, locking down the set and how, you know, all of that plays out in production. So I do recommend checking it out, guys, but I wanted to go through a really big hangout readout session, you know, get into some of my breakdown thoughts after certain paragraphs that really just get into the meat and fiber that makes up this movie. And I know here we praise the film a lot based on how excited we are about it, but I feel like things like this, hearing it from the mouths of the director, the producer, whether that's Zoe Kravitz or Pattinson himself as well, just really affirms the hype machine that has been generated for this movie. Because I think even though we haven't seen it, whether the script or whatever you don't agree with, or I might not like a certain part of the story, I can still appreciate this movie on so many different levels. And I feel like everything I've just read out just adds layers and layers and layers of reasons onto why I just said what I just said. So Bat Family, I think I'm going to end this video there. I've still, believe it or not, got more Batman videos to make, which I'm sure you're probably happy to hear. I've still got a discussion series video planned, which I was going to do in place of this video, but then all of this stuff came out, so I put that on the back burner for now, but there is more content to come. So make sure if you are brand new and somehow you got here, especially at this part of the video, do subscribe for more Batman videos just like this and other videos. I do recommend checking out my other content on the channel. A big thank you to everyone who's supporting the channel, whether it's channel members who are appearing on the screen right now and patrons. I really do appreciate the extra support you give, and all of the guys who send super chats in the live streams, or even if you just leave a like on this, which I do encourage you to do right now. Do check out the links in the description or the top pinned comment to my Twitter, my Discord server, and other places like that. But I'm gonna love you and leave you now, guys, so thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on just absolutely everything we discussed in today's video, and I guess that I'll see you guys in the next Batman video. Goodbye.